Good afternoon, viewers, and good afternoon, everybody across the developing world, especially our compatriots and fellow African brothers. We greet you in the name and spirit of Ubuntu from South Africa. As we say, welcome, it's good to have you here. Today we're going to be discussing the concept of free trade. And we're going to be discussing whether or not free trade is working for Africa or not. To argue in favor of the position, we have Lifa and Siyabonga, who are going to argue that the model of free trade and growth is working for Africa. And to argue against the motion, we have not two but three people, Zinhle plus one, as well as Onke. I think we have to give a very big hand for our debating team of Zinhle, who has shown that pregnancy is not a disability. So Zinhle, thank you for striking a blow for women. Yeah. So without much further ado, I know that this is an audience that is pregnant with excitement. We're going to have Siyabonga arguing for the motion. Thank you, Siyabonga. Sorry, I'm told that we're going to have Siyabonga opening, Onke opening for us, and he's going to argue against the motion. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Onke Kwabe. The model of export-led growth isn't working for Africa, and I am for this notion. So, export-led growth. Export-led growth, also referred to as export-oriented industrialization, EOI, is a trade and economic policy that actually aims to speed up the industrialization process of a country, since it's deemed that industrialization is what will lead these developing countries to development. It's a process of a country by exporting goods for which the nation has a comparative advantage. So in the case of Africa, since we have so many vast minerals and gold and such, we'd have a comparative advantage over that in the context of export-led growth. In essence, export-led growth signifies opening domestic markets to foreign competition in exchange for market access in other countries. During the periods of the Great Depression and the years after World War II, developing countries faced a difficult time in terms of their economic development. An initial solution to this dilemma was to adopt the import substitution industrialization policies, which rendered ineffective to the awakening of the model of export-led growth. So why isn't export-led growth working for Africa? First and foremost, export-led growth strategies require an educated and disciplined labor force. All countries that promoted export-led growth invested heavily in human capital by ensuring that employment and housing and other social amenities such as health facilities and education are readily made available at affordable prices. Today, underdeveloped nations are weak players in a much more competitive system. Export-led growth requires very good infrastructure with ports, roads, airports, and railways. We also awaken to the fact that global trends are rapidly changing, with people being hooked on branded products such as iPhones and such. So the goods that we produce have to be in the global value chain, in order to survive competition. But the problem lies in the nature of production of this global value chain, that we need to have certain infrastructure and technology to produce these products, which we are unable to enter this global chain as a result. African countries end up selling mostly raw materials to other countries for manufacturing, when in fact success depends on the greater need for foreign technology acquisition in order to compete in auto manufacturing and electronics industries. There's some data which was captured by Quantech and the South African Reserve Bank for 30 countries in Africa, including those such as Botswana, Malawi, Swaziland, and Namibia, from 1990 to 2005. They actually reflect that African countries export in large quantities products such as gold, platinum, coal, and diamonds, while we import finished products such as crude petroleum, finished gold products, cars, and vehicle products. When you look at the numbers, or maybe in terms of value, the amount we receive for products such as gold, platinum, coal, and diamonds, in exchange to how much we pay for these imported products, there's a very huge gap, which I'm sure we all know that if we import more than we export, that will have a negative impact on our balance of payment deficits. And it's on that basis that we say that export-led growth isn't working for Africa.
Well, thank you, Onke, and thank you for keeping within time. Actually, for shaving off winter time. So thank you. Just on that note, Zinhle, we will extend that extra time to you. You're welcome to please, as you want.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Siaba Mamzuli, and ladies and gentlemen, sorry. Thank you for that correction. I'm going to be arguing for export-led growth strategies by using two case studies to show that export-led growth is a global strategy that has been used in other countries and that can actually benefit Africa. So my case studies come from Japan and South Korea. Now, in Japan, these export-led growth strategies were adopted in the 1960s. Given that Japan was a country with limited resource endowment, it was necessary for them to export. Therefore, importing raw materials and turning them into value-added finished goods and exporting them across the globe. As a result, the Japanese economy grew at exponential rates between 1960 and 1991. And according to Aogose, Japan's real gross domestic product, taking inflation into account, grew at an average of 9%, while the rest of the OECD economies grew at 4% over the period of 1952 to 1973. This is more than double the growth experienced in more industrialized countries in America and Europe. Now, this case study proves the following things: that export-led expansion can be a catalyst for economic growth. Increases in foreign demand for domestic exportables can have a positive impact not only on the overall growth in employment, but also in the income of the export sector. Now, Helpman and Buchman also concur that exports can shift resources from a less efficient sectors to a more productive export-led sectors. Furthermore, export growth allows for the exploitation of the economies of scales, meaning that the more you produce, or the more quantities of goods that you produce, your production cost decreases. Also, export growth promotes the transfer of diffusion of technical knowledge in the long run, which will solve our skills issues, especially in South Africa and across Africa, through skills transfer that export industries bring. Now, in South Korea, in the early 1960s, South Korea was amongst the poorest countries in the world, with a per capita GDP of $158, and around those years, Ghana's per capita GDP was at $186. However, the South Korean government actually turned into a policy of industrialization and focused on producing commodities for foreign markets. The country began to grow. In 2016, South Korea's GDP was standing at $28,000, and its economy was ranked 5th in the world, behind China, the European Union, the United States, and Japan. South Korea exports almost everything from consumer goods to industrial products to commodities, textiles, food products, and chemicals. South Korea, now dubbed the king of exports, has managed to shift its country from being a developed nation to from a developing nation to being a developed country. This has led them to provide better living standards for their citizens. Now, unlike Japan and South Korea, Africa already has a pool of natural resources ready to be converted into value-added finished products. Countries such as South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola export billions of dollars in goods and services across Africa and in continents across the world. Stats SA confirmed that South Africa's real GDP increased by 3% in the last quarter of 2017, with exports in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries contributing to 0.9% growth in GDP, surpassing those of mining and finance industries. Now, it should also be noted that our agriculture industry also exports finished goods across the world through value chain supermarkets and distribution networks. An example would be a company like Tiger Brands exports finished goods to over 25 countries across the globe. Now, thanks to this emerging export-led expansion, South Africa has managed to export over 1 trillion worth of goods in 2016, supporting over 1 million jobs, of which 400,000 of those jobs are youth employment. Thank you.
Thank you, Siyabonga. Just to note for our foreign viewers, 1 trillion rand, works out to just about $85 million US at current exchange rates. Right? Now, to rebut Siyabongo's arguments, we have Zinhle, who has been given an extra allocation period to rebut arguments. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Zinhle and the other. Okay. Now, as Siyabonga has mentioned about the Asian countries and everything, so I'll firstly start here. Now, over the last 30 years, the East Asian countries have achieved this sustained rapid growth, and yes, as mentioned, their economies have developed rapidly through export-led growth. However, these countries have faced certain conditionalities or very specific historical, political, and legislative conditions that have allowed them for the success that he was mentioning. And to mention just a few, the Japanese producers were given preferential treatment and access to the US and European markets under the US influence, got a lot of support in aid. Secondly, the domestic production was explicitly protected from outside competition until local business entities had become strong enough to compete internationally. Now, there were also certain domestic factors such as respect for authority and order and being an authoritarian state. Now, thirdly, I can mention that South Korea and Taiwan were heavily connected in overseas marketing networks. This allowed their firms access to export markets that virtually no other country enjoyed. Without these protectionist policies, it is doubtful that we can say export-led growth could be as successful in other countries as it was in the Eastern Asian countries. Now, to move along, the question which we can then arise, or the question which arises, whether export-led growth strategy is suitable for Africa, and if African countries can emulate this development experience of the East Asian countries. And the answer to that we can say is no, we shouldn't be mimicking the export-led growth method. Now, Cheng, in his 2003 article, states that in order for developing countries to adopt methods used by developed countries, they will need to impose tariffs on their industries, which will be higher because these times have changed from then to now. Now, he further states that developed countries imposing free trade and laissez-faire industry policies are, in a way, kicking away the ladder that they used to climb up themselves. And also, I can further say that we can also look at our borders. Like, Africa does not have strict borders, which is a hindrance to these export-led growth methods. Developing countries must be allowed to adopt policies that are more suitable to their stage of development, as this will help them grow faster, as it did for them in the 1960s and 70s. Africa is very different from industrial countries in terms of politics, governance, and history, as I've mentioned. We've inherited debts in the colonial governments and borrowed money from the IMF and World Bank. That in its own has an impact on the way things are right now. Dambisa Moyo has argued that Africa needs to shift away from this dependency on industrial countries, and the export-led growth strategy is further causing this dependency that we are seeing. It is important also for African countries to also pay attention to their domestic growth, since the more that there is a global demand and we are exporting more, they tend to neglect the supply of goods and services domestically. And according to Rangisem in 2009, it is important to recognize that too much of reliance on exports could make a country vulnerable to external shocks, as was the case for Asian countries during the Asian crisis in the late 1990s. Now, the Asian crisis has highlighted the importance of what has been termed the balanced growth. While the term balanced growth is not clearly defined, but then it is taken to mean that economic growth should not be heavily biased toward external demand at the expense of the domestic demand. by focusing more on export rather, countries neglect the most important markets, which is the domestic. And over the years, the export boost failed to stimulate the domestic demand.
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, all. Zinhle and Onke can sit down.
Oh wow.
They can take several seats. Africa has already adopted export-led growth strategy and it's working. If we're looking for the world's fastest growing economy in 2017, the World Bank says we should lower our gaze to Africa. We'll find Ethiopia there. Ethiopia grew at about 8.3%. And not too far from Ethiopia, there's Tanzania, which grew at 7.2%. Ethiopia reached this position partly because it increased its exports by 17.6%. This is the country that had a GNP of 177 billion PP dollars in 2016. Perhaps it is a big coincidence that countries such as Nigeria and Egypt that captured most remittances in 2016 in Africa also have the largest GDPs in Africa. Most of sub-Saharan economy is essentially agricultural based, with about 70% of the population employed directly in this sector. This agricultural economy dominates the export basket, so more employment for people in the sub-Saharan Africa, which is maybe we should abandon the export-led growth because we don't need such problems where people are being employed. The export sector can play a crucial role in the growth performance of the country's economy. In addition to increased GDP margin, it generates much needed foreign exchange and earning that is essential used for imports of the country. The ELG strategy normally leads to efficient resource allocation and exposure to international competition, which forces firms to adopt modern technology and produce quality products that meet demands of the sophisticated consumer in international markets. This is further supported by a 2014 study by Grace Muhoro, which tested the ELFG hypothesis using the evidence from Kenya. This results showed that the ELG hypothesis can be verified and the causality is unidirectional, running from exports to the GDP. And guess what? Kenya is in Africa. The ELG strategy promises improved quality of life in communities that can benefit from improvements in the export infrastructure. Things like roads, the ports can be used by the communities. And you can look next door. We can look at PE in Volkswagen, which is situated in the Eastern Cape, where the communities have the lives of the communities have improved. Being there, Volkswagen created jobs. There's infrastructure that can be used by the communities there, or another improvement. In the future of exports in Africa, in 2018, African Union Summit saw most African leaders signing trade deals that will promote intra-Africa trade. The possible talk of African currency are also on the pipeline. The future for export-led growth in Africa is looking bright.
Thank you for that, Ifa. Yes, two things. and I could be mistaken, ELG, export-led growth. We are too fond in development studies, like we'd see here in acronyms. So for those of you who didn't understand, ELG. For those of our viewers who aren't familiar with the format thus far, we're also going to take questions and then have closing arguments by either side. So without much further ado, we'll take questions in batches of 3, please. And please send your questions and your comments at the bottom of this video. We'd be very glad to answer them, but not in our live session. Thank you. Please. Batches of 3, please. So that's Manfred, Nkebo, and Pandile. Please go ahead, Manfred. Remember, is it to both the groups or the comment? Please, you're welcome to.
It's a comment to both, I think.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So for me, I think the global problem with the whole talk of Africa is that when we talk of Africa, we suddenly mention African countries. So, okay, so I was asking why is that, for example, Sia, you mentioned Japan and Korea. Why not use African countries in your argument? I found that we, including myself, we perpetuate the very problem that we should be against, which is comparing developed countries to developing countries. So I probably would have believed you if you used an African country. But because the issue is Africa, so the current issue of what you're portraying is what is Africa to Asian countries. So instead of that, I felt like why not use an African country in your argument? Because the issue is what is the issue or what is the problem with Africa, instead of saying what is the problem with Africa compared to these developed countries.
Please, we'll take in batches of 3, then answer it, please.
My question is to Lifa. I mean, we spoke about Ethiopia having increased their GDP through trade. I mean, but then what do you have to say? For example, in Ethiopia, I know that coffee is one of their biggest exports. So what do you have to say about the exploitative nature of multinationals that work with coffee farmers, for example, in terms of trade? What do you have to say about the dynamics of them having the resources to change raw products into raw coffee into proper coffee without actually incentivizing coffee farmers?
Sorry, and then Pandile, just to make sure that anyone getting off the hook, as this to the side that is against you.
I have questions for both sides.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much. The first question is to Anke. In your argument, you mentioned that much of this comparative advantage that we have when we support the export-led growth. When we don't support the export-led growth, we need to have infrastructure, roads, ports, and so forth. And you mentioned that requires highly skilled individuals. In South Africa, we've experienced the skills shortage. Up until now, government doesn't even know how many, the skills audit of the country, how many people have certain skills and how they can then, if we were to follow that growth path, we wouldn't know how much skills we have and what type of skills we have. So, in what then motivates the assertion that export-led growth is not good for Africa, noting that we already have a skills shortage? And then for the group, for us, yeah. I think I'm going to follow in Matthew's footsteps, because while we note the progress made by both Japan and South Korea, their context differs remarkably from that of South Africa, noting both the colonial and apartheid regimes that took place. So this idea of the trickle-down effect has not really materialized when we look at Africa. The poor remain poor, and the influence of foreign debt, as Zintle had mentioned, and corruption and other influences have actually made sure that this trajectory of growth that you guys talk about has not actually benefited the poor. How then going forward, can we make sure that it actually reduces the inequality that we face in the country?
So let me just get it straight. You're just saying there are certain structural barriers which might not. Okay? Excellent. Just because we've got 3 questions directed to the side that is for the export-led growth model, if we're going to ask Onke and Zinkle to start, please, while this side gathers their thoughts. Would that be okay? Oh, excellent. Good. We have a true believer in the model. Please, hear more.
Just to answer Martha's question and a bit of Vanila's question, and in the beginning of my argument, I stated that I'm using these case studies to mention that export-led growth strategy is a global strategy, where it first began and how it has improved those countries. Obviously, the conditions are not similar between Japan and South Korea compared to African countries like Ethiopia and Kenya. That part I left to my colleague here, Rifa, to explain now what is actually happening in Africa. So I was taking it from a global context when I use those case studies. Another thing is that by using those global case studies, you know that there was a World War I, World War II. It affected all countries. But then what happened, especially in Japan, was that they rejected all other forms of Western-imposed policies, neoliberal policies, and they actually adopted interventionist policies where the state plays a role in shaping the industrialization of that country. So that's why I used those examples. Most African countries actually did not do that. Most of them were in debt. They had to finance those debts through the World Bank and IMF, and they had conditionalities attached to those debts. So Japan managed to actually reject all forms of Western imposed policies. That's why through the period of the 1950s to the 1970s, their economy was growing at 9%, while the US's economy was growing at 4%, because they rejected most of the Western imposed strategies.
So are you saying that we should adopt such strategies?
I'm saying that if Africa actually rejected the Western imposed policies, which further exploited our economies and exploited the raw materials, like Japan, we would have been in a better position, and maybe our export industries would have been in a better position.
But and I think it's a bit disingenuous, because if all this happens, the fact is we are, in the midst of signing up to these policies which advocate for free trade, the lessening of restrictions on our trade. Is it just a bit unhelpful to say, like, if we had done this, the fact is we are in this?
No, I'm saying that Japan did not do that. Those are neoliberal policies on trade liberalizations, which Japan did not do, which were mostly imposed on us during that period, and which led to a lot of economic instability.
Do you think it is possible to exist in a global trade and then also wanting to sort of create your own, not wanting any policies to be actually be put in place by those people that exist in that trade, you are existing within that trade?
That's why I use Japan, because it's a unique industry. They actually rejected those policies. Meanwhile, they were trading globally, and the economy was growing at exponential rates.
So, okay, do you have anything to add on to that? Because, yeah. Okay. Please, and then the question about multinationals. You might get back to.
The question about multinationals in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Most of export-led growth, which happens within a country, is caused by multinationals. In China alone, over 50% of the goods, the export goods, are actually manufactured by multinational companies. And joint ventures, if you include joint ventures between the Chinese government and the multinational companies in China, it's over 70% of the goods produced in China that are actually exported outside. So, and multinationals actually benefit that country through employment creation, and through taxes because they count as the GDP or they contribute to the GDP of their country.
But
Yeah, please go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, but then are we benefiting as much as those multinational companies and
For example, Starbucks, the amount of money that Starbucks makes and the people in Ethiopia, the farmers don't even have what you call it? I'm sorry to make this about coffee, but in Ethiopia, they don't even have like proper resources to actually, produce that coffee. But yet Starbucks is making so much money out of taking those.
It's the same situation as the case study that my colleague mentioned of Volkswagen being in PE. We could debate that actually Volkswagen is the one that's benefiting, but if we go down probably to the communities, that they actually have jobs and their lives have improved. The thing is with African countries, we don't have the capacity to develop our industries. So we rely mostly on multinational companies. It's the same model that China actually adopted. It's the model that was firstly adopted by Mexico. But then Mexico had a lot of labor laws that were not flexible. So China actually adopted the same model Mexico was adopting, but developed their economy, their currency, and made sure that the labor laws are less restrictive.
And sorry, Onke and Zinhle, if you could, if we just let you guys off the hook now. Onke and Zinhle, if you could just address some of Bandile's questions and comments, please.
Yes, Bandile, I'm not sure whether or not I interpreted your question properly, but the whole increase of exports through cheap labor has actually caused resentment where people are actually losing jobs. So in terms of the skills shortage, we could attain such the phenomenon of the brain drain, where we're having skilled labor leaving our country due to what I'm alluding to the fact that export-led growth isn't working because of this human capital that needs to be invested, of which I think we lack in terms of infrastructure that I was attending to. So that's why I believe that we have this phenomenon right now where we can't get our human capital to a point where we are able to compete internationally, where we are able to use export-led growth as a strategy to work for us. I'm not sure whether or not I'm answering your question.
No, I think that's the problem from the onset, that we don't even know how many actual scientists in the country we have, how many engineers, how many psychologists we have, how many people graduated with. We don't have that database to say these are people that we can check. Obviously, it would be easier if we go through universities or certificates and they give us records of people who have graduated, maybe for a certain period of time. But there's no publication that I've seen from government that says we've identified that this many skills in the country is this many skills on these sectors, so we are going to create an economy for those people so that those people can be absorbed. So it's sort of disingenuous for us to say we are lacking skills, whereas we don't know what skills we're lacking and where we could use those skills. So that's where my question is structured.
And just know that we have another batch of we'll have another batch of 3 questions now. If you have any questions at the back. Anybody? Yeah. And just while we're getting more and more comments, I'm sure you're also welcome to ask questions, Zinhle. Okay, to members of Cluster Group. You're welcome to ask questions. And I noticed that you're very fond of mentioning the PE example and automotive industry. But we've protected them for a while. We've got very high tariffs. Isn't that proving the Onke and the Zinhle's point that you need to nurse and protect these industries rather than subscribe to just free trade? Or
well, you have to have strategies to make sure that we do produce, as in we do profit in the end. The only problem is exporting less than exporting more.
Well, if I may just count it, because the question on Keba, I think it was sort of a free pass for multinationals, which you're suggesting. Like, if we could actually just get back to it, like, and if it was handled adequately or to your satisfaction, but if we could get back to it, like, right, because this model of multinational-led growth, like, versus vis-a-vis the people, I think we could get back to it a bit later, could deal with it a bit more fuller. But while you do have a think on that, you're welcome to ask questions as well. Any other questions? We've got Mandile here, introduce her, yes?
Yes,
And just, we've got time for one more question in this round. Okay, sorry, yes. Please, we'll start with those who haven't had a chance. Please introduce her, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to ask the other people who are since they are agreeing that we doesn't have the capacity and the infrastructure what are they proposing? Because Kenya is we are exporting because it's quite we are doing agriculture because that is what we are normal to do when there is other things such as other countries. We are relying on them because that's what we have gold and the demand. That's why we are exporting. So what other alternative do you have?
Please, Mandile.
I think my question is around multinationals. Like, multinationals have too much power because you find that there are certain labor laws, there's certain number of people with disabilities they're supposed to hire, there's a certain number of women they're supposed to hire for a certain size of an organization, but they don't do that. And all of the time we are told that we need to nurse these multinational corporations because they're providing us with something, whereas they're making way more than what they pay the people here. So it cannot be that we have an economy that nurses interests of another country, because those people, and I hear to use our people as cheap labor, they're not giving them proper services, they work under appalling conditions in some of the instances. And people must be grateful that they have something. It cannot be. I think if we are to take this export-led growth trajectory, we need to make sure that there's a sufficient balance of power between these multinational corporations, the states, and the government.
Excellent suggestion. I think might also be a good time roundabout now to distinguish between South Africa and the rest of Africa. Or that might be because South Africa, as I'm sure our viewers know as well as the audience, many of our national champions, or what have now become multinational corporations, have been implicated in some less than savory dealings across the continent. So when we are talking about for Africa, would there be a different set of policies between landlocked Zambia and a country like South Africa, which does have a lot of high infrastructure development as well as ports and facilities? So perhaps we should just keep that in mind on that note, John. Yeah. And Margaret, please.
The Jews already asked, but okay, I do have a bit of a question for again. You were talking about comparative advantage of natural resources. So, okay, to me, I was just asking where, because we don't even own half the natural resources that are in Africa. So, hypothetically speaking, if I found a diamond at the back of my house, it belongs to De Beers, and De Beers is not an African, so where's my advantage in that?
But De Beers is African. It is an African company. We'll start with you. Okay. Any other questions? Please don't go easy on Zinhle. Okay, yeah? Please, anybody else? One more question. Sorry for the next round. Okay. Anybody would like to start first? Lifa.
There's one thing that I've noticed recently which is just my own observation, that there's a growing resentment on multinationals. And I think the problem with them is the thinking that multinationals are here in Africa for us. But everyone goes into business for themselves. So if they're here in Africa, they're here to gain something, and we let them in because we want to gain from them, rather than just they're here because of the sentiment that they're here to help Africa or aid Africa. It's just they're here for business.
Maybe just after being implicated in coup attempts across Africa, are we just gonna be like, must we just allow them to come and exploit us because you know what, this doesn't fall under the mission and vision of our company?
Maybe just to answer Adele's question as well. This happens across the globe. It's not only Africa. As I explained, in China alone, they are exported goods. Most of the countries, most of the companies in China are not from China. They are multinationals from across the globe. So it's the issue of capacity, and this question is always debated whether multinationals are benefiting the economy or not. Maybe through strict government regulations, but then other people will argue that if you impose strict government regulations, then they'll actually move away to less strict countries. So it's always a debatable question. But my point of view, or our point of view, is that export-led growth has been boosted by multinational corporations who have the capacity to come and set up industries in those countries and produce goods that are exported out of the country.
So, Onke, I see that you're looking very frustrated there. Like, please go ahead and comment.
Yeah, I actually want to try and attempt to answer.
Oh, okay. So it's not on this side. Okay. Sorry, are you guys competing? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, please.
So yes, to try and answer your question, my worry is that since by having a comparative advantage, it means you're able to use what you have to your advantage because you haven't invested in amounts. What I'm worried about is that in the South African Reserve Bank, we're using this very gold and minerals to say these are our reserves, this is how much we have, but we are still using that as ways of trading. Yeah, well, export-led growth can be seen as the way to go, but for how long? Because maybe a strategy should be articulated around the fact that sustainable growth requires a greater reliance on domestic demand. So we should work on our own domestic demand. We need to invest in fixed capital. That fixed capital, I believe, will absorb the surplus labor that will be there. It will induce higher investments. It will create more jobs. We need to realize that we can't just focus on economic growth in a case of Africa, because there literally are no new ideas on how to deal with poverty. Current policy approaches have their origins in earlier thinking on development. Why not use new approaches, formulate new strategies, work on our domestic demand? So that's how I kind of think about this whole.
If I may, it was brought up earlier, the need for strong states and the developmental interventions approach by states. If you could just comment on that, I know it's very popular in policy circles at the moment. We talk about a developmental state. Can you just comment on that as perhaps rising to Nduduzo's challenge of an alternative rather than this entirely free market job? If you would at all, it's fine if you don't have any comments.
Can we just think about that a bit? Can we think about it?
No, that's no problem. Yeah. And then we have time for one more round of questions, or one question at least before we have closing arguments. Please, Ntobeko. Everybody else? Okay, good. Please, Ntobeko. Final question, Ntobeko, please.
Okay, I was just trying to save my face by not asking anything coming forth. It may happen that these arguments are mistaken during the presentation. But my question goes to the which is against the motion. I'm trying to understand the feasibility. Is it feasible to do away with the non-export trade rule for any economy? I'm saying this because basic standard of trade model says that for any country to get supplies and more than your demand, you just have to export. Otherwise, you will actually import. And secondly, obviously the whole world is actually moving toward globalization. Then, but particularly for South Africa, we have made many national friends such as your BRICS, which are one of the strategies to make sure that this export-led growth is actually in our benefit. And more recently, the president or the government itself has signed the free trade, the African Free Trade Agreement. So is it still feasible now to actually do away with this export?
Maybe to try and answer your question, in the reading, Dick Chang, there's a statement where they say virtually all of today's developed countries did not practice free trade or industrial policy for that matter. So rather they promoted their national industries through tariffs, subsidies and other measures. So I do think maybe the information available to us isn't showing us the other side of things. We seem to think as if this strategy of export-led growth, the way free trade is theorized, it didn't happen practically in these countries. There were certain conditionalities that allowed them to be able to strive in export-led growth. So I do believe that we should be able to adopt new strategies.
But those kind of strategies, such as your tariffs, they are there to make sure that the trade is in our behavior, is in our benefit. Not that we are actually opposing, just to make sure that it is in our benefit. Not that we are opposing.
How do we tilt the terms in our favor? So while we think on that, okay, you can perhaps include that in your closing arguments. Might I invite the side that is for free trade to have closing arguments, please, before we go to a vote?
In conclusion, on why we state that we support the motion that export-led growth is beneficial for Africa, we state that export expansion in Africa has significantly contributed to the economy or economic growth and employment creation. And as a result, South Africa is no longer a third world nation, as it maintains a healthy balance of payment through excessive exports. Now, our exports are slowly reducing our deficits caused by the large number of imports that we are currently experiencing. Now, African exported goods and services can benefit from stronger exchange rates compared to weaker domestic currencies. Africa's emerging export-led economies must therefore be preserved and expanded, as they are the main solution that can address our current account deficits and also reduce Africa's reliance on debt financing.
Thank you. We'll attempt to answer your question after my concluding remarks. I was reading a logical piece. It said, if following an expert-oriented path is beneficial for country A, then it should also be so for country B. Ladies and gentlemen, ceteris paribus, all things being equal. There are signs that we are at the initial point of a new region where the rules of the game will not be nearly as accommodating for export-led strategies. Unemployment is the most pressing social and economic problem of our time, since it is closely related to poverty. And not all countries can rely on exports to boost growth and employment. More than ever, we need to give greater attention to strengthening our domestic demand. Long-term success still depends on what happens at home rather than abroad. Thank you.
So thank you to both groups for some very compelling arguments. We are going to leave our viewers now, but before we do, you've heard all the arguments. But before we do, we invite you once again to go online to vote on this motion as well as the others in the series. Until next time, where we're going to be, there's going to be a slight change, and we're going to be discussing whether or not women, am I correct? All right. We're going to be discussing, is this the one that's coming up next Monday? It's going to be discussing whether or not women should support the policy of expropriation, land expropriation without compensation, that is. Please stay tuned for that one. In the meantime, we say goodbye from sunny Durban in South Africa. Thank you.